I've worked at different companies from traditional firms to universities to startups, and of course my current job today as a FANG software engineer. I recently came across an article which was titled "What Silicon Valley Gets About Software Engineers That Traditional Companies Do Not." These are practices that end up resulting in faster innovation at the company level, better professional growth for us as engineers, and just better utilization of our skill sets. And consequently, Silicon Valley companies can and do pay much higher wages, and they get more value out of the same person. In this video, I'll go through this article together with you to talk about the 6 reasons why a Silicon Valley-like company was able to break the traditional work culture. Okay, so the first reason is autonomy for software engineers. In traditional companies, developers get work items assigned to them, most often Jira tickets. These tickets are vetted by the product or project manager, and they have the most key details to do the work, and they're expected to do just that. There's little need for questions about the ticket unless it's about clarifying a specific detail. So I've had this similar experience previously, not just in tech, but even as a student with schoolwork and other particular jobs. The problem here is that your value is closely defined on how well you do on this specific ticket and how many tickets you can handle. And because of that, it's almost like a one-on-one trade-off of your time towards money. And the more directly it's correlated towards time, the less leverage that you have as an employee. It does make sense why traditional companies would do this, because your value as an employee is very easily measured. They can just see how many tickets you handle, how much time you spend, and because of this, it's very easy to track and quantify. Now, this is in contrast to a Silicon Valley-like company where you see little of this. There are projects and there are program managers and engineering managers, but for the most part, engineers are expected and encouraged to figure out the how of the work, including making larger decisions. In some places, each project would even have an engineer leading it who facilitates breaking up the work. At other places, engineering managers or senior engineers could do this work. Regardless of how it's done, all engineers are incentivized to look at the big picture, to unblock themselves, and to solve any problem they see. So I totally agree with this part of the article because this is what I've observed during my work. And in a previous video, I talked about how the most common misnomer that students think is that your job is going to be all isolated with you coding whichever project you're meant to do. But in contrast, it's very collaborative because you're encouraged to think about how your coding fits the entire big picture, and you're often encouraged to figure out the best and right solution for the problem that you're trying to solve. So in my opinion, the value from this, from an employee perspective, is that you can show your value not just in a strict one-to-one trade-off of your time, but also you can show your value by making good decisions and showing that you can create a more efficient system. Now, the next reason doubles down on this because it says, number 2, Silicon Valley companies promote curious problem solvers, not just mindless resources. So traditional companies tend to think of an engineer's time of 8 hours to spend on coding. Any time that's not spent in front of a computer doing coding is often thought of as waste, and they justify this with high cost. I've heard a lot of people describe in meetings like this: software engineers get paid more than any other functions. We need to utilize them accordingly. We can't have them run on empty. Now, again, this is in contrast to Silicon Valley-like companies where they think of software engineers as the people best suited to solve the problems that the organization has. They hire not only for technical skills, but communication and problem-solving ability. Their thinking is a bit more like software engineers are our most highest paid in the company. This is because they can bring some of the highest leverage through coding and problem solving. We want to expose them to the business, so while they're doing normal work, they can also find more impactful opportunities for the business. This is why, again, in a previous day in the life video, I do talk a lot about how a lot of the work is beyond coding and it's a lot of problem solving. In particular, I found the article incredibly accurate in talking about some of the specific examples that could occur where you are expected to think more than just coding. As I've mentioned previously, in sort of the engineering ladder, as you move up in that ladder, the less coding you have to do. So the most coding you'll ever do is as a junior engineer, and in order to sort of exponentially increase your value, it's going to be less about coding, but more about the decisions you make on the larger projects as a whole. The third reason is just about making that a more efficient and doubling down on that, because internal data, code, and documentation is extremely transparent in Silicon Valley-like companies. So employees, not just engineers, often have access to real-time business metrics and data sources to write their own queries and create customer reports. At Skyscanner, we would get a daily summary email and a daily revenue breakdown. At Uber, there would be a weekly growth newsletter with similar metrics weekly. So again, from an employee perspective, this is also fantastic because, for me at least, you get a sense of how the business is being run and which metrics you own. Now, while as a junior role, maybe you're not as involved with the business metrics and sort of how to increase that, and maybe your work is a little bit more separated from that. But this, of course, depends on the company. And again, you can think about how directly your projects are benefiting customers. I'm going to skip through the next reasoning in the article about communication and come back to this, but I think what directly relates to this is Silicon Valley companies investing in a less frustrating experience for developers. So again, developing in 2020, which is when the article was written, can be extremely frustrating. Not because of writing code, that's actually the easiest part, but the surrounding things like setting up your dependencies, dealing with production or test environments. Now in a big company where there's a ton of dependencies and a ton of projects, this can get extremely complicated. Tech debt is real. Things change, code is sometimes not maintained properly, and it is a huge issue. The part that I think is really interesting is the mindset that engineers have. If something is not well documented, this is called out immediately. And in addition, if there are areas where systems can actually automate it instead of an engineering having to manually deal with it, we write that script right away and we automate it as soon as possible. I think this is in contrast to normal jobs. If something is really boring and something is mind-numbing and difficult, we kind of just accept it rather than figuring out ways to automate that experience. Okay, I'm going to come back to this communication aspect. I do feel like this is important to mention, but I feel like this is something that is more commonly known, which is, again, traditional companies will encourage hierarchical communication. This is to supposedly shield the engineers, but mostly because managers prefer to be the information hubs and they don't want to give control over that part because that's sort of their main value. But in Silicon Valley-like companies, you sort of go direct to the engineer. You have engineer to engineer communication, which cuts down sort of the middleman. Now, I do think in general, this makes it much better for employees, but that's not to say that managers don't have value. But again, I think this changes sort of what managers have to deal with for their job description. They have to demonstrate more value beyond just being an informational hub. They have to really understand the technical details, which is why a lot of managers come from software engineering backgrounds. In addition to that, I feel like managers, their skill sets will change to more so how they can manage the team, as well as the overall culture within the team. And finally, if you add all of these things together, this is what results to higher leverage for employees and ultimately higher pay. Now, this goes back to what I was originally saying, which is if you're in a traditional industry or if you're in a traditional company where you are trading more or less one-to-one your time for money, that by definition is less leverage. And in this diagram, this is what is shown. The pay is lower than FANG companies, but the leverage is much lower because you're really trading one-to-one. Whereas Google, Facebook, some of the other established companies with high salaries today, they are using leverages of scale. An engineer who is able to build features or able to come up with original ideas might be able to create something that millions of people use, which is again, scaling exponentially rather than doing a one-to-one sort of dealing with a ticket issue. And this is proven in this diagram, where in most big companies, these sort of tech teams, these tech hubs are actually the most highest cash generators, which is every software engineer that they hire, yes, they are paying them a lot, but they actually offer higher leverage and they increase the overall revenue of the company. They're paying you this much because it's actually worth it for them to hire more software engineers. But this might change because of AI. Now, this entire question of how AI affects the scalability of software engineers in these companies is an entire topic in and of itself. So if you're interested, please subscribe and stay tuned for that video next week.